Hi there everyone, today I'm reviewing The Science of Storytelling by Will Storr. I confess that I already have an interest in the meaning of story, influenced by myth and Joseph Campbell, so I was interested to read a more recent interpretation of heroic themes and tropes across stories. Detractors have often felt that Campbell perhaps oversimplifies mythic tropes, and Slashaw adapts them to fit the structure he's kind of trying to create, where when he's kind of wrote about the monomyth, where all myths kind of conform to this single story. But I believe that most would agree that there are commonalities that we always see. You know, things like a hero, a guide, a tragic event, and a call to adventure. It's kind of hard to make the argument that those don't exist. You see them across films, TV, and books all the time. But what does a modern interpretation of this look like, especially, when you begin to incorporate science and other developments and knowledge that we have about the brain and people? What does that mean for these tropes and, why they're so important to include in a story? Well, Storr looks to break down not only the common tropes, but why they resonate and, some of the psychology behind it. We know there's usually a hero or heroine who acts heroically, selflessly for the greater good of everyone. But why is that so important? Why does the hero have to have something bad happen to them? Well, this book kind of asks those questions and delves into them. In some ways, this book it sort of feels kind of dense at around 230 pages. There's a lot packed into those pages, but it would be unfair to describe it as such because Will Storr's writing really just flow effortlessly. I actually read the book in, a day, probably, a few hours. I sort of went really fast through it, despite actually, taking my time with it even, to think about what was being said. I just think that's kind of a compliment to Storr's writing style. It is helped by it being a bit shorter than the usual kind of 300 to 400 pages that I think generally most books I read tend to be, but also the writing style. And this could be a subject where it gets bogged down in specific points or arguments, because it's kind of drawing across personal anecdote, psychology, mythic tropes, and then sort of taking examples from literature or film. So it could be easy to get sidetracked here, but he's really good at staying on topic and kind of moving forward, but still making interesting arguments and exploration. So he's brilliant at blending science, dramatic, and literary study to explore these questions around storytelling. So the book is divided up into the following chapters: creating a world, the flawed self, the dramatic question, plots ending and meaning, the sacred flaw approach. In all, they tend to comprise of, as I said, a blend of psychology, drama, and kind of real-world examples or parallels. And, some of these ideas may be familiar to those who have read around the subject. A good starting point is actually Aristotle's Poetics, for example, or, like I mentioned, Joseph Campbell. Typically, it's fairly accepted that the kind of hero has to have some kind of problem that he or she confronts, and that the hero has to overcome this problem for the good of the village, community, or world, or worlds, or even universe, I guess. But the value that Storr adds to this discussion is the psychological aspects and kind of, he'll sort of talk about a scientific paper looking into the psychology of a certain thing and how it applies to storytelling. Why do we find these topics and approaches particularly interesting? For example, a lot of it is to do with how curiosity works. And I open quote, "Curiosity is shaped like a lowercase n. It's at its weakest when people have no idea about the answer to a question, and also when entirely convinced that they do. The place of maximum curiosity, the zone in which storytellers play, is when people think they have some idea but aren't quite sure," end quote. That's from page 18 of this book. So we have to kind of relate to the story somewhat through the characters, or, seeing ourselves in them, or knowing people like some of the characters, and understanding what they have to go through in order to deal with the problems and setbacks that occur in the plot. Without any relatability, we lack attachment to the story. And if the story is also conversely actually laid out too clearly, it becomes too predictable or tedious, and it doesn't really have that sort of curiosity aspect. So that's kind of what he's talking about there. There's kind of a balance between these things. Similarly, David and Goliath narratives, which are discussed on page 99, are relatable and important. We all believe that morally we act in a way that makes sense, or at least we have justifications towards the ways we act, reasons and cause and effect, for understanding how and why things have turned out a particular way for us. And so the events in the story typically provide a decent understanding of this, or it will lack meaning. There's going to be problems the hero faces. Maybe someone dies and he has no control over stopping it. And how does he kind of react to that? Does he just kind of give up and go, the world is just a terrible place, bad things happen, I can't do anything about it? Or do they have to kind of go through that acceptance, or even revenge or vengeance? And obviously those are very relatable emotions. So our kind of morality and the fact that there is this kind of David versus Goliath aspect to the hero and the world is really important, and that kind of helps provide meaning both in life and storytelling. We have to see this in the stories we see, else again we tend not to care, just like the curiosity aspect I was talking about. In some ways this book doesn't feel comprehensive because it is a more readable take that interprets and applies psychology to interpreting why tropes and approaches in storytelling resonate and work effectively. Sometimes it is even predominantly anecdotal, talking about the author's high neuroticism and low extroversion, for example, on page 170, and kind of exploring what this means in terms of interpreting storytelling. People who have been socially successful tend to pay attention to people chatting and socializing if they're kind of shown a school corridor in one psychology experiment, for example. There's lots of social interaction going on, and people who have been successful socially tend to kind of look for that. But then those with a history of loneliness and isolation barely even notice these events going on. It's really interesting. Our brains have an impact on what we look for, and perhaps that isn't really that surprising when it comes to storytelling, and it's going to influence how people interpret certain stories. I think there's classics like Dostoevsky where most people generally agree that they're superb, but perhaps some of these aspects of why some people might just not get on with it, because it might be different life experiences influences how you see these things. But then again, I guess the whole argument of this book is that there are certain tropes, there's certain aspects that everyone pretty much identifies with. The appendix speaks of the sacred flaw approach, influenced by the psychologist Jonathan Haidt, where he argues that defined sacredness is to find the compelling aspects, because whatever a person or character holds as sacred is where irrationality will be, Haidt says. So Storr kind of applies this to storytelling, saying that, if we look for the kind of broken, irrational aspects of characters where they might just believe something blindly, then you kind of have to go on a journey to fix that in the character. The character kind of has to figure out that, okay, I held this to be true, but it's actually not. My world is not the set of circumstances. I can create it into a new sort of paradigm. And that's actually the key to a good story. So in terms of final score for The Science of Storytelling, to criticise this book is really difficult because the combination of psychology, references and anecdotes are compiled in a really compelling way. I'm fascinated by the subject because clearly we have some attraction to what this book covers. The kind of storytelling just has these universal tropes that are hard to ignore and, are very commonplace. And they seem to just work a lot of the time. Some may disagree with these interpretations or feel that there is too much of an emphasis on how our brains have adapted from hunter-gatherer times, a narrative that pervades almost every popular science book, I have to say. But whether you think it's overemphasized or accurate, I think in The Science of Storytelling, this book does an almost flawless job of exploring what those tropes and ideas in storytelling mean, why they're relevant, and why good stories from Harry Potter to Citizen Kane contain them. If you want a book covering these aspects, this is really a must-read. It gets a 9 out of 10. I would actually say it's almost a it's almost flawless in trying to set out what it's trying to do. It's very readable. It backs up what it's saying. It approaches things typically very logically. I just think probably there's certain aspects that could be covered more. It might need a longer page count actually to do a better job, because I think this is actually quite a difficult thing to write about. But nevertheless, this is like a must read. If you're interested in these themes, try this out. So I've got plenty more reviews across a range of subjects. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.